This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. I am very excited to welcome Dr. David Yamane to our podcast. David is a sociology professor at Wake Forest University and an internationally recognized voice in the debate on guns in America. An Asian American and lifelong liberal from the San Francisco Bay Area, David became a first-time gun owner at 42 years old when he began a 12-year journey into the complex world of firearms in America. David's new book, Gun Curious, a liberal professor's surprising journey inside America's gun culture, was published in June 2024, and it chronicles his experiences with sociological insight. His scholarly publications also include the peer-reviewed articles Gun Culture 2.0, Evolution and Contours of Defensive Gun Ownership in America, and Understanding and Misunderstanding American Gun Culture and Violence. He is an avid blogger at gunculture2.0.com and a YouTuber at the Light Over Heat channel, where he posts weekly short videos about issues related to his scholarship. So welcome, David.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So I want to open with where your book opens. So your book opens with this story of vulnerability, of feeling profoundly vulnerable, perhaps for the first time in your life. And it's an experience that ends up driving you to seek out the means of protection, which ultimately takes shape as a 12-year journey that ends up with you carrying a firearm and becoming a super owner. So I want to start with that experience. Can you describe it and how it ignited your interest in gun culture?
Yeah, well, I think that experience took place at a particularly important time because for a couple of reasons. One, I was just wrapping up my previous project on the sociology of religion, and I was looking for a new project to investigate going forward that would have to be anything other than religion. And I was really kind of starting to notice guns out in the world around me. I was watching Top Shot on TV. I was talking to people who I knew in North Carolina who were gun owners or who had used guns previously. And so, when I had this moment in my apartment parking lot where I tried to intervene to assist my neighbor, and that just sort of spun in a direction which didn't feel very good and made me feel, as you said, very vulnerable. The idea of guns as a potential sort of remedy or way of addressing that vulnerability was very available to me. There was something really almost primal that kind of welled up inside of me because in that moment I had my two youngest kids with me. I just at that moment realized that I had really put not only myself in a vulnerable position, but I also put them in a very vulnerable position. And there was nothing I could really do to protect myself or them. I think it's one of those moments that really became a pivot point, but that it wouldn't have pivoted in the direction it did if guns weren't kind of available culturally as a response to that. Like I say, if I was in Half Moon Bay, where I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that happened, my first instinct wouldn't necessarily have been, I need to get a firearm in order to protect myself. Now, in truth, I didn't just drive from my apartment over to Gander Mountain to buy a gun, right? But it was an easier step to make than it would have been at a different place or a different time in history.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you balance sort of the scholarly cap versus the personal story as you just laid that all out for us. And I'm curious, though, it's one thing, obviously, to immerse yourself in gun culture. It's another thing to study it. Were there points where you just felt like that tension was really there? How did you navigate sort of balancing the personal and the academic as you started and as this journey unfolded?
Yeah, I guess I didn't really feel a lot of tension in terms of negotiating those situations, I think. And there's a sense in which, because I was becoming personally interested in firearms, it made it easier for me to navigate some of those situations because I had more credibility perhaps than someone who was simply observing gun culture at arm's distance might have. Now, I still, whenever I went into an observational situation, I would introduce myself. I'd say, hi, my name is David Yamane. I'm a sociologist, but please don't hold that against me. Kind of icebreaker. Then I was able to establish the fact that, hey, I'm really trying to understand you on your own terms, in part because in a sense, I am you, so that gap that oftentimes exists between us as sociologists and our research subjects was a little bit less than it might be were I studying, say, people from another country, people from another culture, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and that gap closes over the course, obviously, of your 12-year journey. And so going back to the pre-journey, David, what were your experiences with guns? And I'm particularly interested in what were your stereotypes about gun owners?
I grew up San Francisco Bay Area, as you mentioned. I say jokingly, half jokingly, perhaps the land of unicorns and rainbows, blissfully unaware of guns. And so guns weren't even really on my mind as either a good thing or a bad thing, but as a kind of orthodox liberal, if someone had asked me, what do you think about guns? I'd say, well, they're terrible. I had many other more pressing concerns on my mind than firearms. And so coming into it, I didn't even really have negative stereotypes about gun owners because I didn't really have any thoughts about guns. So really, when I first started to encounter guns on a regular basis in North Carolina after I moved here, that was when I really started developing ideas about guns and gun owners. And because the people I was meeting who were gun owners were people I played tennis with and IT guys and my real estate agent and my fiance, I began my work with the assumption that guns are normal, right? And normal people use guns, as I like to say. It's almost like I had the opposite set of assumptions that many sociologists bring to the study of firearms.
One reason, among many reasons, that I think it's sometimes difficult for scholars to jump into this area is terminology. There's a lot of gun lingo that makes it really intimidating sometimes to move into gun spaces. I just want to say that I really appreciate the glossary that you include at the beginning of your book. I actually wanted to do this with citizen protectors because I was so frustrated with having to translate terms across audiences. And my editor actually told me it would be a terrible idea for an academic book, so I didn't do it. I am so glad that you did. And so I'm wondering if you had some reflections on how even the words we use, and some of it's because we're using different terminology, sometimes we're using the same words to mean totally different things. If you could reflect on how that really gets us jumbled up in being able to talk meaningfully across this gun debate.
Yeah, I think a lot of the terminological debates that we have are a reflection of the lack of trust that we have in one another when we talk about guns. And so anytime someone might slip up and say accidentally use the term clip instead of magazine, or you've probably seen a lot going around, about high ammo stocks that a senator has recently said, and people trying to figure out what on earth he meant. But, if we had more trust in one another across the divides in this debate, we would just let those things slide. As if you're sitting down at Thanksgiving, well, I guess that's maybe a terrible example, but if you're sitting around with a bunch of friends and one of your friends slips up in something they say, you don't attack them for that, or you don't dismiss them.
Well, we used to not attack.
Yeah. Well, with your friends. That's why
Yeah.
I thought Thanksgiving may be the worst possible example of that. So I, really wanted to include a glossary in part because I remember before I knew anything about guns, trying to figure out what guns were, how they worked, what different things referred to. And I still have to use the glossary myself when I'm talking about, different parts of a gun. So, the book is really designed for a whole range of people, from people who know a ton about guns to maybe some people who know nothing about guns. I think that's how it's useful. I don't think it will overcome that lack of trust that we have in one another that makes us so attuned to the language that we're using in particular. But I certainly in my own life and in my own work dealing with people, if someone misspeaks, I may not even correct them because that's not necessarily important to do in that moment of a conversation. It's a symptom of a deeper problem.
So two words, though, that I do want to unpack with you, or two terms rather, are gun culture 1.0 and gun culture 2.0. Can you explain what those two terms mean, why they matter, and how you identify with them?
Yeah, I have some regret actually about introducing the term gun culture 2.0 into the sort of lexicon for reasons I'll maybe get around to. But when I was, again, getting into guns, and we all think of our experiences as being very unique, but as a sociologist, I realized that I wasn't just getting into guns, but I was getting into an existing culture, and a culture that was evolving pretty profoundly at the time. I came across this term that gun journalists used called gun culture 2.0 to identify what was happening with gun culture in the present, which had to do with self-defense, oftentimes had to do with new and non-traditional gun owners getting into firearms, good development of the training community, the concealed carry revolution, and so on. And it just clicked and made perfect sense to me that that was what was happening in the present. And so, I thought, well, if that's gun culture 2.0, we need to trace back and figure out, what is gun culture 1.0? And that then becomes that period, say, from 1850 to 2000 or 2010, where really the center of gravity of gun culture was hunting, recreational target shooting, and collecting. So those are kind of gun culture 1.0 activities. And again, the downside of this concept is that it's easy to misread as thinking that I think that all of gun culture is gun culture 2.0, when in reality, what we're talking about is kind of the center of gravity of gun culture shifting towards self-defense, because of course, hunting and recreational shooting and collecting all still continue to exist. And also gun culture 2.0 itself is diverse. There are people who are super into tactical aspects of gun culture. There are people who like to LARP. There are people who are just trying to figure out how to protect themselves and their families. And so gun culture 2.0, I think, is real. I feel like I've documented empirically its rise and its centrality today, but we can't take that concept too far. We have to realize that it is, as all concepts, it's an imperfect reflection of a very complex social reality.
Yeah, one of the kind of speaking to that issue of periodizing gun culture, I know you know Chad King of the National African American Gun Association, and one of the points that he makes is, maybe gun culture 2.0 is just the Black tradition of gun culture that long predates year 2010, 2000, or, even the 20th century. So I think it's actually really interesting to think about these concepts, not just in terms of the lines they draw in the sand, but how they open up new questions and new perspectives. And so kind of along those lines, I'm curious, thinking about your journey into gun culture. Obviously, gun culture 2.0 being really the defining element of this is self-defense. It's interesting to think about gun culture 2.0, as you mentioned, in some ways being more inclusive than gun culture 1.0, but I think in other ways is more daunting. There's different ways to sort of compare these two and sort of the bar of entry. And so I'm curious, if you were, say, in a moment where the center of gravity was really hunting, do you think you'd be writing a book about your 12-year journey into gun culture 1.0? So tell me about how gun culture 2.0 really is part and parcel of your story.
Yeah, I think that the reality is that hunting, even recreational shooting, and certainly collecting are more sort of geographically and demographically exclusive or concentrated, we might say, whereas self-defense or security or safety is a universal concern. All of us have some level of concern about that, some more than others. Some it comes out later in life, and it wasn't for the first 40 years of their life. And some people will address that concern for safety with a dog or an alarm system, or they live in a gated community, or they just lock their doors and hope for the best. And some people will respond to that concern with firearms. And this, to your earlier point, certainly in the same way that hunting and target shooting and collecting are still part of gun culture today, self-defense has always been a reason for people to own firearms historically. And so again, this is one of the downsides of using that 2.0 concept. But, again, if I could get into hunting, right, I could get into collecting, But there are real barriers to doing that in terms of being able to get out into the field or having the resources to do collecting, not to mention the interest. And I think that was why I was becoming attuned to guns, but then the real trigger, so to speak, was that welling up inside of me of a real profound desire to figure out how to protect my kids. And I think that is something that is much less geographically and demographically concentrated, right? Every person might have that type of moment. Again, not everybody will look to firearms as the response, but it's certainly very available today. And it's certainly, I think, in my view at least, a reasonable response to that concern.
I want to go back to the book and a quote from the book that really stuck out, which was this. Gun culture 2.0, and this is a direct quote, has the potential to be more inclusive because self-defense is a universal concern. Now, obviously, as you note elsewhere in the book, guns and the idea of self-defense have been used as tools of domination, but also as tools of resisting that domination. And so I want to dig into this idea of gun culture as inclusive, especially when it revolves around self-defense. And so one of the things that I noticed is that I actually expected a bit more diversity in terms of the different people that we met along the way with respect to your field work. And I think part of that is because you are really focused at very elite levels of gun training. Also, I think because you are taking us into a 12-year journey where, quite frankly, I think gun culture has gone through massive transformations. I would really like to hear about what you saw changing over the course of your 12-year journey, especially with respect to inclusivity and diversity. And I just want to hear about really how you've seen this space change, not just at the sort of the level of elite gun training, but sort of across the board.
Yeah, well, this book wasn't initially supposed to be the book that I was going to write about gun culture. The book I was going to write about gun culture was going to be called Gun Culture 2.0. It was going to be more of an academic treatise about gun culture and the evolution toward defensive gun culture. And then, I could slot in African-American gun owners and NAGA. I could slot in women gun owners and A Girl and a Gun and other women shooting associations. I could slot in LGBTQ gun owners. And so the full diversity of contemporary gun culture really would have come out more because I decided, for reasons we might talk about, to go in this more sort of personal story direction. I didn't want to just kind of go out of my way to be like, oh, and then there I was at the NAGA National Convention, which I did go to. I wanted it to be sort of a more naturalistic feeling of what the processes that I actually went through as I was becoming a gun owner and as I attempted to become a responsibly armed gun owner. That's where some of the diversity kind of falls away. And then in terms of evolution of gun culture in this sort of 10-year to 12-year period and that I've been studying it, I think, one of the big changes has to do with that increasing diversification and that diversity within gun culture 2.0. And oftentimes, I can't do it graphically here, but the meme where you have the three Spider-Man all pointing at each other, and it's sort of gun culture 2.0, gun culture 2.0, gun culture 2.0, because certainly if you're a member of NAGA or you're in the liberal gun owners, you're not 100% cool with people who are oath keepers or 3%ers. And as non-traditional gun owners have become more prominent within gun culture recently, some of those divisions, I think, actually come out more. And I've had people respond to me on social media. One person said, why would I want to support liberal gun owners? The last thing I want is for liberals who are my enemies to own guns. That, I think, is becoming tension. And people often ask me to speculate, what's the next evolution of gun culture? And, one possible evolution of gun culture is just a fragmentation into various different ideological and political camps, all of whom, own guns and are like the Spider-Man, except they're pointing their guns at each other. They're not pointing their spidey webs at each other.
Yeah, that raises such an interesting question of whether there is a center to gun culture. I mean, self-defense, I think absolutely that is a central piece. But typically, when we think about academics and how they think about American gun culture, they will put a particular organization at the center, which is the National Rifle Association. Obviously, over the last few years, there's been some real shifts in sort of the standing of that organization. I find it really interesting that you actually don't center the NRA really at all in this argument, in the arguments that you make in the book. And I don't think that's at all an accident. So obviously you've spoken at their events, you've engaged with the organization, but in no way are you using the National Rifle Association to sort of, quote unquote, explain gun culture. You just sort of let the organization be a side note in the book. And so I guess I'm curious how you came to decide to include, or rather not include, the NRA on these terms, and how you see the NRA relating to gun culture more broadly.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons I pivoted away from doing the academic book initially, is because sent in to Oxford University Press a proposal in several chapters of a book that didn't center the NRA, and one of the reviewers lost their mind because how can you write about American gun culture without? I hope that wasn't you. I didn't sense it was you that lost their mind.
I got the same critique about my first book that was published with Oxford, and though I do put the NRA in, I think a lot of reviewers wanted more NRA because how else can you explain American gun culture?
Yeah. Well, I've as well known. I find your treatment of the NRA and Citizen Protectors just brilliant because it is a quasi-regulatory organization and its power is much more than just 800-pound gorilla stomping around in Washington, D.C. And if you only look at it at that level, you're missing a huge part of the story. So in any event, I really, in part because my experience of getting into guns was very not NRA centric, other than the sort of things that were happening in communities, like someone's an NRA certified instructor, or I take a basic pistol class, or this range is NRA certified so that I can get insurance. And, maybe I overcorrected, but I really did want to tell a story of American gun culture that didn't center the NRA because, in my view, that was already done, right? Everybody has written about the NRA. We still have books coming out about the NRA, including some incredible books, like Matt Lacombe's book is incredible. Alex Philindra's book is incredible. That ground is covered. I'm trying to kind of cover a different perspective on guns and gun culture, and maybe one that's a little bit more percolating from the ground up in this particular book, Gun Curious. If I ever do go back to the Gun Culture 2.0 book, I do have to think about what the appropriate place of the NRA is in that story.
I appreciate you breaking down how you approach this book because I have to say it really kind of defies genre. It reads as a memoir in many places and an autoethnography in others, an in-depth study in certain parts, particularly in the chapter on elite gun trainers and their worldviews and perspectives. So it's many, many books in one. So I just appreciate that insight in terms of, how you came to craft this book the way you did. So I want to read a passage from your book that I really appreciated, which was this. If there is a single overarching lesson I've learned in my search for the truth about American gun culture, it is the importance of understanding that guns are not one thing but many, and paradoxical at that. They are fun and frightening, dangerous and protective, diffuse and concentrated, unifying and divisive, attractive and repulsive, interesting and controversial, useful and useless, good and bad, and neither good nor bad, end quote. And so in my own work, I have found that it is very, very hard to keep this sort of paradoxical nature of guns into focus. There is so much pressure from really both sides of the debate to land on a simplistic approach, an easy, clear, simple takeaway. And so I would like to know what you've done, how you have kept yourself focused on this message.
Yeah, I think this really comes out of my own personal experience of spending most of my life completely outside of gun culture and spending a small part of my life deeply in gun culture. But at the same time, my everyday life, when I come to the university and do my work here, that is outside of gun culture again. And so I'm constantly, as Victor Turner would say, betwixt and between these different positions. That really keeps me in dialogue with people on both sides of the issue. and really forces me to try to understand and even act as a mediator or translator from one side to the other. And there is a strong desire on both sides to see guns in one way, in unidimensional ways. I once, in my frustration about trying to get my book published, mocked up some book covers, that both, were the same image of me holding a gun, but, the one was, guns and the demise of American democracy, and one was guns and the salvation of American democracy. And those two positions absolutely exist. I think it would have been much easier to get a book published if I would have taken one of those two positions. But, part of the reason, at least those editors who passed on my project, who gave a reason, some of them just said, it's too low heat. I don't know who is going to get riled up enough to want to buy this book. And, as I see routinely books being published that take one side or the other, they probably are onto something. They know how to sell books. They know what markets are for books. And there may not be a place for a low heat highlight book like mine, and to be determined.
So you spend quite a lot of time talking about becoming responsibly armed and how it impacts how people, particularly people in a democracy, relate to one another. So on the one hand, there's the argument that gun culture 2.0 as a defense-oriented gun culture necessarily makes people more paranoid, more fearful, more afraid of each other. On the other hand, there's the argument that gun culture 2.0 actually makes people more likely to engage with one another because they aren't afraid, they are prepared. And so thinking about these two arguments, it's hard not to see that they make massive assumptions about people's baseline feelings of safety and fearfulness. So, for example, in my research, I've talked to Detroiters who, citing the city of Detroit's high rate of violence, definitely experience carrying a gun as a means of being able to move in public with far less fear and more preparation. But on the other hand, I've definitely encountered people who have had no firsthand experiences with violence who do come out of gun training more, shall we say, paranoid, because it's the first time they've ever really considered that they could be a victim. So I'm curious how you navigate all of this.
Yeah, a lot of the way I navigate this particular issue is kind of reactively in terms of what I see people saying about a world that I've spent a lot of time in, and trying to paint it with a very, single monochromatic, let's say, brush. Whereas I think, the reality is much more complex. I mean, it's hard to, there's no numeric values we can put on this, but let's just say colloquially, for every person who comes out of gun training, being paranoid and wanting to avoid people, I see many people who, I shouldn't say many, I see other people who come out of their gun training, with the exact opposite orientation. That we know that gun owners are, very civically minded. We know that they're very engaged in political life and community life overall, based on surveys. They tend to vote in higher numbers or higher rates than non-gun owners. That may not make people very pleased who don't like the way gun owners often vote. But, they are involved in their communities. And so when I see people, and I won't name names here, but if you read the book, you know who I'm talking about. What they say about the effect of gun training says at least as much about their own psychological makeup and their orientation to guns and violence as it does about, what they're observing in their firearms training classes.
So I have to talk about one piece of the book, which is, it's actually not one piece. It comes up kind of throughout the book, which is the drinking and carrying piece of your argument. I have to say I was a little surprised by it, especially because I find so much of the gun training that I saw in my research and in the work that you describe in your book as well, really emphasizing that gun carriers really have to hold themselves to the highest level of responsibility. And so I've never really heard gun carriers really taking issue with not being able to drink and carry. So for our listeners who may not be aware, generally, if you are licensed to carry, David, I'm assuming you probably know the exact numbers by state, what the rules are and whether there's any, even being able to have a sip of a drink. But generally, alcohol and guns are not allowed with respect to carrying in public. Maybe there's a little grumbling about that. gun carries, it seems like they're much more concerned about, no carry zones, AR bans, other kinds of more heavily debated laws. But it comes up in your book a fair amount, especially outside of the gun training context. I'm just curious if you could tell us more about that. I definitely see, and feel free to elaborate on this, the way that you draw out a comparison between, how we regulate alcohol versus how we think about gun regulation. But yeah, I'm also just curious about this drinking and carrying stuff that you mentioned throughout the book.
And I don't have the specific numbers by state, but there is a range. For example, in North Carolina, you are able to carry concealed if you have a permit in a bar or a restaurant that serves alcohol, but you cannot have any alcohol in your system. Whereas in the state of Illinois, you can drink and carry as long as you're below the threshold that's set for drinking and driving. So I think 0.08 blood alcohol content is acceptable. I think everybody agrees that it's a bad idea to be drunk and to be carrying a firearm. What constitutes drunk, can be part of the legal definition. Where I really think about this comparison is I grew up in the era of Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Students Against Drunk Driving. It's always been culturally verboten, in my world, to be drunk and to drive a car. And yet we are against drunk driving. We are not against drinking, nor are we against driving. Whereas there, is a very strong movement to stigmatize gun owners by drawing on ideas. David Frum does this in The Atlantic. He says we need to make guns like we made drunk driving, right? And he's really conflating two things that you shouldn't combine with one thing. If somebody is an idiot and drinks and drives, I don't feel morally obligated or morally compromised, rather, as a drinker and someone who drives a car, right? But I'm supposed to feel responsible if someone is an idiot and uses a gun in a harmful way because I'm a gun owner. There's just different responsibilities that we assign to things. And really, the conflation of drinking and driving is very different than the mere ownership of firearms. And that if someone is drunk and using a firearm, that's as bad as drinking and driving a car or combining lots of different activities, which in and of themselves are not problematic. So that's the kind of line that I'm trying to draw there, trying to negotiate, because honestly, people are hurt by drunk drivers every day. And I don't ever sit down in my house thinking, wow, maybe I should stop drinking, right? Or maybe I should stop driving my car because somebody was killed last night by a drunk driver.
So you note at the end of the book that for all your engagement with gun culture, you are still a liberal professor. And I think you, in some ways, answer how this is so actually in the first few pages of the book when you talk about your tragic optimism as a guiding approach to how you think about the issue of guns in America. So can you explain what this is and why it is something that liberals might uniquely bring to American gun culture?
Yeah, I think this is, again, one of those ways of not seeing everything as either good or bad, that we can see things as being bad, but also having the potential for good. I'm a generally optimistic person by nature, although, life does introduce more and more over the years that tragic sensibility. There's this sense among people within gun culture, that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. Because I became a gun owner in part because I had this moment of being mugged by reality, that all of a sudden I'm supposed to become a conservative, when in fact I don't know that my fundamental political views have shifted much since I was, a very young man. The hope that I would be red-pilled somehow in the process and come over to the other side just because I happen to own a gun, I think is just folly. And fortunately, I think I am also kind of coming of age or maturing as a gun owner at a time when there are many liberal gun organizations to kind of give you a plausibility structure, to invoke sociological language, right? A plausibility structure that makes being a liberal gun owner kind of make more sense and less of an internally contradictory feeling.
We are are recording this before the book comes out, so in some ways this is somewhat of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I could really ask it about your whole body of scholarship on guns. I find it so fascinating how people relate to this issue. Sometimes they totally fulfill the stereotypes in terms of what they want to hear. But I've also had experiences where giving talks where people are really eager to have a different kind of conversation. I think, and I'm sure you've experienced this, you get some very interesting disclosures from people about, by studying this topic. And so I'm just really curious if you could just tell us what has been the most surprising reaction you've had to your work, whether this book or other pieces of scholarship. And I think actually that question, I'd love to ask it both for audiences within the academy, within academia, as well as audiences at large.
That's a really difficult question because there's a sense in which I feel as a member of the scholarly community, studying guns, kind of working on the margins, that people do, acknowledge the fact that I exist and that I do my thing, but I'm certainly not in the center of where the field of gun studies is, or I think where it's going. And so, I don't have those kinds of interactions where people are like, wow, I've never really thought about it that way before. I wish I did. I wish I had some conversations where, people would say either that was insightful or you're a complete idiot and here's why. I generally don't get either one of those kind of responses. I think when I'm out amongst the people in gun culture, the biggest surprise response is that someone who is teaching sort of a core institution of American higher education is allowed, in quotes, to do what I do. Things like taking my students to the gun range. That blows people's minds that any American university professor would be allowed to take their students to a gun range. Or the very fact of teaching a course with guns in the title. So, I think this combines, on the one hand, a misunderstanding about what higher education is like, and I take the opportunity to clarify, hey, I'm a tenured professor. I have academic freedom as long as there's an academic rationale for what I'm doing. There's no reason for me not to be able to do these things. On the other hand, I do think that there is a fairly persistent bias against guns in American higher education. And I've spoken to a number of faculty who want to teach courses on guns in which they would take their students to the range, but they're just not allowed to take their students to the range because it's somehow seen as more dangerous than allowing their students to drive to some other city in their private vehicle. That surprise response, I think, has an element of stereotype, but then that stereotype also has an element of truth to it.
So I want to kind of get back to the big picture and sort of all of the big and small decisions that you undertook in writing this book. And, there's certain sort of intentional choices that we can kind of glean from the book. So you don't name mass shooters at all during the book, which I assume was a conscious choice. You do talk about, for example, very sort of the belabored decision you made to include an entire chapter on AR-15s. And so I'm always curious about the kinds of decisions that writers make. And I was wondering if you could share what was the hardest decision you made in terms of either something you included in the book or decided not to include.
Yeah, well, I think, the not naming mass shooters is an easy one. This is something that a lot of scholars are choosing to do and trying to encourage media to follow suit. So that was easy. But I think, you identified the inclusion of the AR-15 chapter was probably the biggest decision because it's such a fraught issue. It's so easy for people to start talking about AR-15s and then their ears close up. And I thought, no one would notice if AR-15s weren't covered in this book. They could just read from one chapter to the next. Maybe that's not true, but I felt that when I was trying to make that decision. But then, I felt that I had to sort of honestly engage what is probably the most difficult issue to engage in my experience. And so it does have a very belabored introduction where I try to kind of enter the issue. I hope that people who read that will actually feel the tension that I felt in writing it. But the bottom line for me was always to try to tell the truth. I talk about having a negligent discharge in my apartment in the book. And my wife was saying, you can't put that in there. It looks terrible. And I said, it's the truth. And it's very important for people to know that that is part of my truth. And that's also a reality of gun ownership, that guns do introduce risk into households. This is one of the risks, and that it's something that people can address and mitigate through education and training. So that was easy for me to include, but it was something that I did have, many conversations with my wife about the wisdom of including it. The AR-15 chapter was a big struggle in my own thinking, in my own heart, and my emotions. It was very fraught too. But in retrospect, as I read through the book and as I see what the book is, I think that it was the right decision.
Yeah, and I think when you're writing from the perspective or with the goal of bridging a divide rather than deepening it, those decisions become so much more fraught. And I want to maybe allow you to release yourself from the bridging divides kind of perspective for a moment by sort of really taking advantage of your unique position as sitting at this intersection of being a liberal, being a professor, being a gun owner. I guess if you could let go of the bridge and instead say, hey, liberals or sociologists or academics, however you want to, describe that side, this is what I wish you understood and what is so hard to get through to you. And for the gun owners, this is what I wish you understood. This is what I'm just so very much wanting to get through to you. So you don't have to bridge. You can be as direct as you want.
But the thing is in specifying those two things, that is the bridge, right? Because we need people to understand why other people think the way that they do, right? That is a sort of precondition to understanding, I think, which is a precondition to building those bridges. But from the perspective of what people outside of gun culture, what should they know about gun owners? And I said this unintentionally a long time ago on another podcast, is that gun owners are people too, right? Gun owners have families. They are concerned about violence. They want safety. That you can't approach gun owners as somehow being one thing, and that thing is all the things that you hate, racist, misogynist, etc. I think that if people appreciated diversity within gun ownership and the humanity of gun owners, that would be a great start. And I tell my gun owning friends and anybody who will listen to me within gun culture that, when you're approaching people who are gun violence prevention advocates or gun safety advocates or gun control advocates, whatever we want to call them, right, that they adopt these positions for reasons and for very good reasons, right? That they either directly or indirectly have experienced the negatives that are associated with the widespread presence of firearms in the United States, right? And this, again, then brings us right back to the paradox that we began with, which is that guns are good and bad. And from one side, they see the good, and from the other side, they see the bad. But if each could better appreciate, why do you see guns as being so good and why do you see guns as being so bad? That's what I would and do tell people when I have an opportunity to engage one or both of those audiences. And I think that if people with open minds and hearts would listen to that and try to understand that, that's bridge building.
Yeah, thank you for that. So wrapping up now and thinking about gun scholarship, gun scholars, what advice do you have for scholars who are looking to engage in this area?
I mean, I don't know that my views on this are very useful to people because, my own experience and my perspective is that if you want to do any sort of critical engagement with the field of gun studies, you should be a tenured professor. That if you're a junior scholar getting into the field, that you need to largely swim with the direction that the field is going and obviously create some unique niche within that. but this is not the time to take a critical approach toward the field overall. And maybe that's true of every field, but I feel like it's particularly true in the field of gun studies because I've talked to many graduate students who say inspired by my approach, and they take it forward to their advisors, and their advisors say something along the lines of, this really isn't critical enough about guns. So if you don't have a fundamentally critical approach to guns, I would say do not study guns unless you're already tenured.
So that might kind of lead into my next question, which is, what is the question that we, and I guess the we is academics, scholars, researchers, what's the question we need to be asking about guns in society, but are not?
I like to make reference back to a fellow UC Berkeley alum, Charlie Kurzman, who wrote a book about why isn't there more Muslim terrorism. And I think that he really turns the question of Muslim terrorism on its head. And I think that gun scholars could stand to turn our general approach to understanding the negative outcomes with firearms, which is important to understand, but it's only part of the reality. And so I ask the question of, given the fact that there are perhaps as many as 100 million gun owners, perhaps as many as 400 million guns in the United States, why aren't there more negative outcomes? Guns are literally everywhere, right? And we certainly have issues with negative outcomes, but given the availability of firearms, why aren't there more?
And so last question, you've mentioned a lot of books, but what book are you reading now?
Well, these are both somewhat, one is very personal, one's maybe less so, but I'm reading Cal Newport's Slow Productivity, The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout, because after I get this book launched, I am moving into my era of slow productivity because I have, for the last 20 or more years of my career, been going at 150%. And as I have many fewer years ahead of me than behind me, I'm not going to spend the remaining years of my life doing that. So it's not a great book, but just the idea of slow productivity, I think, is something worth thinking about. The more important book, and the one that's more relevant to our conversation here, is I'm reading Michelle Norris's Our Hidden Conversations, What Americans Really Think About Race and Identity, which is based on her race card project. And again, a lot of what I'm thinking about now that the book is coming out is how do we have better conversations about things that are really difficult to talk about? And race is probably even harder to talk about than guns, arguably. But I'm inspired by her work to do something that is along the lines of the race card project that I'm calling Let's Talk Guns. So if anybody wants to go to letstalkguns.org, you do or give your 6 words that come to mind that really capture your story or your understanding about guns in the same way that Michelle Norris asked people to do this for race. And I'm really excited to use that information as a starting point to having better conversations about guns in the same way that I think she's really trying to promote having better conversations about race.
So did you just announce your next project, letstalkguns.org?
This is not a project. This is
buried the lead there.
This is in support of my current work. It may go somewhere, it may not, but it is opportunity to get people to make plain things that they may not feel comfortable saying out loud otherwise.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this conversation. Dr. David Yamane, author of Gun Curious. We're so glad that you were able to talk to us. And yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks, Jenny. I hope that at some point we'll have an opportunity to have a more two-way conversation because I obviously learn much more from you than you learned from me.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.